An initiative of the Greater Des Moines Partnership formed in 2007, the Business Innovation Zone, the BIZ, exists to connect entrepreneurial needs with qualified resources and to provide guided professional and business direction. The BIZ helps entrepreneurs maximize their successes by helping them navigate resources, strengthen knowledge, improve skills, form strategic alliances, and secure proper capitalization. To find out more about the BIZ, visit www.bizci.org.
Anyway, with that, I'd like to introduce and welcome Matt Ostanek. Matt, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Mike.
It's good to have you here. If you would, just to start out, for those who don't know you, can you give us a little bit of your background on how did you end up as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, it was an accident, actually, but I appreciate the chance to be here. Thank you for the invitation as well. Yeah, I think being an entrepreneur has just been a bit of an accident. You know, I started out my career as an architect. I technically still am an architect as well.
So you're still licensed?
I am still licensed in Iowa, but I stumbled into entrepreneurship because I was working as an architect and I was frustrated with something in my job that I thought could be done better, and that turned into creating a solution for it that I realized other people could buy and that it would help them in their businesses. And
that's a pretty common way to fall into the accidental entrepreneur thing, to solve a problem that you
kind of stumbled into it in that regards.
Yeah. Great. So this is not your first startup. We'll talk more about FunnelWise in a minute, but can you tell us just a little bit, your first startup was in the architectural space, or at least related to it. Tell us a little bit about that experience, because it was a bit of a long trail for you. You had kind of gone into it thinking, I'll be done in 3 years, and it wasn't quite 3 years.
Yeah, I think my statement was I'm on record as promising my wife that it'd be a 2 to 3 year project. Yes, that turned into 10 years. You know how those things tend to go as well. Yes. I was working as an architect. I was frustrated with all the paperwork that architects deal with. This was in the early 2000s, and I ended up creating a solution to manage a lot of the construction administration paperwork more electronically. That became a company called Submittal Exchange, which is still in operations here in West Des Moines as well. But built that over a series of years and ultimately got acquired by a Chicago-based construction software company called Textura.
Was that your intent when you started it? Did you think you'd be acquired? Is that what you thought would happen, or did you go into building a piece of software for a long term?
No, I thought it would eventually be acquired. I mean, it seems like that's usually the clear strategy in a lot of software businesses, right?
Yeah. So after that, 10 years, you turned around and did it again.
Yes.
Why?
It was. I discovered I really like creating things. I mean, I think it's a lot of it. I was drawn to architecture as a profession because it was creative, but I've also found for me personally, I even more enjoy the creative aspects of building businesses. You know, creating products, building organizations, working with people, solving problems. That's really, really compelling.
I think it's funny because I've had several architects that have become entrepreneurs, and I'm kind of convinced that there's the education for architects is well suited to entrepreneurs, because it's not, I think because you're forced to, I mean, it's a very difficult degree to get. Architecture is a tough degree to get from what I remember. Yeah. And there's a lot to it, both engineering, project management, there's so many pieces. Yeah. And to me that kind of describes your average entrepreneur that says, you know, I've got to do 19 different areas of business all by myself, getting going and learn all these things, and being able to manage it's a lot of why people do or do not succeed.
Yeah. I would say architectural education is great and helps you with entrepreneurship in many ways. The one thing it's missing is probably any component, actual focus on what it takes to run a business from a financial standpoint. But you don't need to worry about that.
No.
I'm saying that jokingly. But certainly from a creativity and work ethic and all those other things that are important for success.
Well, just the process, because you guys are taught a process of how to look at a problem, and you're taught as architects to listen to the customer, but then go beyond what the customer says. And I think that's, as a products person myself, it's hard when someone says, I want this, and what you realize is what they really want is something a little different.
Yeah. I think another thing that's actually really interesting about architectural education connected to business leadership is it teaches you how to work at different scales. So like you work at a very high level, you know, designing an overall strategy for a building, and then it teaches you to work at the very, very detailed level.
Yeah, like
as well.
Where exactly is
to take a broad vision and go down to the detail level to execute on it very well. And I think that's something that's so important with entrepreneurship as well. Yeah. Right? Because you have to have a broad vision for where you're headed, but you have to turn that into day-to-day details to execute as well.
And that is, I think, I'm looking at a bunch of serial entrepreneurs in the room that I know. That is so much, that ability to translate it to the detail. So you've started a company, it's called FunnelWise. Mm-hmm. So if you would start by telling us what the heck is FunnelWise and what's a funnel, and let's start there.
Yeah. So I'll give you a little bit of the story around it, I think helps. So one of the things I learned in growing Smittle Exchange previously was how to grow and manage a sales and marketing organization that grew from just myself as the first salesperson who had no idea what he was doing with sales to ultimately a really good sized organization. And I think when I left there a little over a year ago, I had over 70 people in sales and marketing that were working for me just in my area of the business. And I would say to folks that sales is both an art and a science, to speak very generically. There's the people side, the relationship side, and all the art that goes into that. But there also is very, very much the science side and the analytics and the metrics around that as well. And in the last few years of my experience with my previous business, I honestly felt like I was spending half my time or more some days managing Excel spreadsheets with tons of data around our marketing and sales programs and what was working, what wasn't. And we use tools like Salesforce.com and marketing automation tools like Marketo or HubSpot. And those tools were fantastic for helping us, but they produced a lot of data that I would spend a lot of time looking at to figure out not just what we did yesterday, but what that means for where we're headed tomorrow. And particularly being part of a larger company when Textura acquired us and ultimately did their IPO, that forward-looking view of what does next quarter hold and are we on track for it or not that was the single most important question in the entire business. And it was very frustrating for me because I spent a ridiculous amount of time on that information. It just felt to me like there was a need for better solutions in that space to help kind of particularly that mid-sized market. Mm-hmm. There certainly are a ton of solutions for business intelligence and analytics in general that tend to be very high-end, very expensive, and can be great if you're a large corporation, but not always as a good of a fit for that kind of mid-size. So that's what led me into that space and that interest area.
Well, it's interesting because I hear in my role, I see a lot of people who are taking something that's been being solved by a spreadsheet for the last 20 years and say, how do I take that and make a real product out of it and connect it? And it's common for a software company to find out their main competitor is Excel and a manual process. That's just a very common thing.
Yeah.
So FunnelWise, tell me about the funnel.
So I'll tell you a little bit more just about the context of how we got to where we are too. I think is important and helpful. So it started out with an interest in building a solution in that space, helping with marketing and sales analytics. I had read a book, The Lean Startup, a couple years ago. It really resonated with me about, really tightening that feedback loop and validating every step of what you're doing with market feedback. And I've said before, I got a little bit lucky with building my previous company because I built something that was for me as an architect, what I wanted, and it turned out to be a great fit that a bunch of other people wanted it and were willing to pay for it too.
That helps.
But I've also been guilty in the past of building some things or having my software teams build things that it turned out the market didn't want as much in terms of enhancements.
But the market didn't?
Yes, or in terms of enhancements or new product offerings or so on.
Right.
And so when I read The Lean Startup, it was like, holy cow, this perfectly summarizes, the right way to do this.
Right.
And so this past year, I started FunnelWise a year ago, so January of last year, and set a goal of going out and getting feedback from at least 100 prospective customers before we actually finished the product design or wrote a single line of code. And
100.
A minimum of 100. And 100 it's a good round number. It's enough that you're getting a broad perspective,
but it's statistically relevant.
Yeah, but it's achievable as well with a lot of effort, right?
Right.
And put together a small team to do that, and we did that over the course really from most of those meetings from February through May of last year, and May is when we hit around 100.
To me that's so important because I do see people that start by building a product and then go searching for a market, and unfortunately that doesn't work out very well for a lot of people. So I'm thrilled to hear you, and I've had some others say the same thing. I think Rocket Referrals was the same way. They set out with a set of skills and said, we got to go find a problem to solve. You saw the problem, but then you went out and vetted that you could find 100 people to give you feedback on it long before creating the actual product.
Yes.
I think the biggest thing I've seen, you've been in the software business for quite a while now, the biggest thing I've seen in being in the market so long is it used to be the hardest part was the software. And with no disrespect to a programmer, it's becoming a very doable part of the process. With a bunch of skilled programming talent, you can build most products. That's not the big if. It's can you get someone to buy it? So I think that's great you did that.
It was hugely helpful. So we were talking to VPs of sales, VPs of marketing, all across the country. We did a number of folks locally, but we did a lot of phone interviews with people across the country as well. And it really helped us refine both the product concept, but equally important, kind of our target audience. To understand. I mean, there's millions of people in sales. What exactly types of companies are we looking for our ideal customer? It really helped to refine that as well.
I take it did you get into who would make the decision and who would be the buyer and who would be the influencer? Did you do any of that?
Yeah, we have enough around that we've got the hypotheses around that,
Yep.
and we've gotten some good feedback from kind of an ultimate pool of people that are saying they want to buy the product and they're willing to pay this amount for it.
Good.
We're in the...
And that's critical. I want to buy it and I will pay this much.
Yeah.
That's a big deal.
Yeah, now, I mean, just to be honest, no one's actually paid that yet because we haven't finished the product yet. So as soon as we get to that point, which is coming up in the next couple months here.
But it makes it a lot easier when you go back and say, time
Yes.
to buy it, and they already know what the price is. And,
Yes,
All
yes.
right. Okay.
So to tell you a little bit more about FunnelWise,
FunnelWise.
very generally. So it was interesting talking to folks. The biggest issue that we heard as a pain point was what I would call marketing and sales alignment, and just the disconnect that happens between marketing and sales. I would say in organizations that have larger sales groups, that have at least 10 or more salespeople, that have a couple hundred inbound leads a month, and more commonly we're finding that in the tech sector. A few companies in Des Moines, a lot of companies on the East and West Coast as well, but a lot of pain around marketing focusing on their numbers and sales focusing on their numbers, and not really the holistic first view of how everything fits together into that overall funnel, but not just seeing what's happening, but also being able to plan for the future. So what, you've got a revenue goal for a year from now, how do you work backwards into that, into what you need to have from a marketing standpoint today to get you to that goal a year from now?
I think if people really knew how fragile most of those forecasts really are.
Yeah.
Craig's been involved. Look at Craig over here, who does a lot of work in the venture capital space. I mean, I used to be part of a publicly traded company. I know how we did it, and it's frightening because it wasn't analytic and it wasn't, well-founded in great fact. And so what you're really trying to do is move that to where the basis of that forecast and that knowledge is past performance, current activities. Is that fair?
That is fair, yes.
So where does the word funnel come into it?
Well, the funnel is, there's a couple different terms that are used to describe the overall marketing and sales process, right? Funnel versus pipeline. We could have a
Funnel
debate
and pipes, yep.
on that. Funnel seemed like a better fit.
So describe for those who don't know what the funnel is.
Yeah, I would describe the funnel as kind of the stages in your marketing and sales process. So from starting with an engaged prospect, someone that you're interacting with, into someone that is what you would call a marketing qualified lead. So they're the right type of company and they've, been to your website and downloaded something or expressed interest, into a prospect that sales is working with, into an opportunity, into ultimately a closed won sale.
Through the funnel.
And in theory, each stage is smaller. It doesn't always have to be that way, but in theory, they are. So it looks like a funnel.
Right. Great. So where are you at now? What's next for you? What does the next 6 months to a year look like for you?
Well, we're getting ready to launch our product. Our initial beta product should be ready to go in about a month or so, month and a half or so from now. Sorry, we've got part of the FunnelWise team here today, so I'm staring at my chief technology officer as I say that. So,
he's smiling. I think I think he's smiling. That's good. Do you already have the pilots named and known, or are you still looking for people for pilot, or where are you at on that?
We're definitely still looking for people, but we also have a core group of people that we've met with in the past year that have expressed a strong interest in it and said, we'd like to try this.
So are integrations to other packages critical to your product? I mean, are you delivering them as integrated? You mentioned HubSpot and Salesforce. So if I'm a company that uses HubSpot and Spotify and Salesforce, are those all pre-wired, if you will, or what does that mean?
Yeah, out of the gate, we're going to integrate with Salesforce.com. There's, of course, a lot of CRM systems in the world. I would say in the space that we're focusing on, which is other tech companies, Salesforce is by far the dominant player for a lot of good reasons.
Right.
And we'll also, over the course of the next year, we'll be adding integrations with marketing automation tools like Marketo and HubSpot and Pardot, and ultimately others as well.
Correct. But that is really what you're doing. Part is to bringing that data together.
Absolutely, and it's part of what you've seen, and I'm not sure if everybody is with marketing automation software, but things like Marketo and HubSpot have really taken off. Tools for inbound marketers to use to nurture prospects, to manage and track their activities and kind of move them through the overall marketing and sales cycle. Huge things. Marketo did an IPO a year and a half ago. HubSpot went public last year. A lot of buzz around that space. It's created a real silo effect, though, because marketing ends up living in their system and sales lives in their system. And what we're providing is a tool that will really bridge that gap.
What this reminds me of is the days of SAP when they said MRCP systems and finance systems and then they came up with this thing called ERP, right? Enterprise Resource Planning. That's what it reminds me of, because everybody's had these siloed systems, right? Accounting had their system, sales had their system. Well, sales didn't have a system. Manufacturing had their own system, and they never talked to each other. So, interesting. Let's open it up a little bit. Questions from the audience?
What were some of the wrong assumptions as you did your marketing? Did you have any assumptions going
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if we had something fundamentally wrong, but I think really kind of that understanding of who we're ultimately going to be the right fit for customers was a huge part of that. It's actually a little bit surprising. I've always lived in a world where things have been very structured. We've always used Salesforce or other tools and been tightly disciplined around that. If you go out and you talk to a lot of just sales leaders in general, many companies haven't even reached that point of structure yet, and so that was probably a bit of a surprise to understand. Part of the reason that we're focusing more on tech companies is those types of companies tend to be a little more structured and thoughtful to get to the growth rates that they want to, whereas in other types of businesses you might not have that type of discipline, if that makes sense. So Todd Redding, who's here with me today, Todd managed that process of scheduling all those meetings and sat in most of them with me. Are there other major things that we were wrong on? I'm trying to think.
We did begin using the term sales analytics when we started out, thinking that was the right term to capture this. And that term it didn't resonate. I don't know if people were just exhausted of overuse of the term analytics or it just didn't capture it. So the term alignment of those two departments kind of came up about, just say halfway through our process.
Well,
to kind of zero in on that.
Yeah, it's interesting, the difference between sales analytics and alignment, because most people wouldn't say, I have a problem with sales analytics. Most people would, when I listen, I think, well, yeah, I've got a problem with sales and marketing not talking to each other. That's my problem if I'm the C-level person. So, interesting.
Yeah, analytics is definitely an overused term.
Yeah.
By far.
Let me ask you this. This is your second startup. What are you doing differently? What did you go into this going, I'm going to do these things differently?
How long do we have?
Yeah.
There's probably a whole list of.
Well, give us the top three that aren't, like detrimental to your whatever.
Yes, I would say that the number one thing for me personally is the first time I did this. Going through. Let's go back to my architectural education. Focus on detail. I was obsessed with details. I still am today, but doing my.
Well, you admit it. You're halfway home.
My first startup, I didn't know which details were important and which ones weren't. And so I think I was very much guilty of just obsessing over all of them, which definitely made me a micromanager at points. And one of the things that I've really tried to challenge myself this next time around is I think I've got a better understanding of what details do matter and which ones don't.
Okay.
Some people that work with me would probably say I still cross that line at points. But
I see smiles all through the back of the room. Yeah.
Definitely trying to be a little more thoughtful. I mean, the reality is, in any business, there's a really small set of things that really, really matter, and you have to get perfect at those, and everything else ultimately doesn't matter that much in the big picture. So understanding that difference is huge.
I always found it important to think, what kind of look back that I did a month ago that mattered?
Yeah.
Because you do all this stuff all day long in a startup and all day and half the night sometimes, and that backward looking, was that really worth spending that 8 hours on that?
Yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah.
Oftentimes taught me what to go. No, never again. I'm done. What else? What else did you do differently?
Getting the right team together very early on,
Yeah.
I think is very, very important. In my previous business, was bootstrapping it. Brought on some investors and some resources through some of the state programs, but was definitely bootstrapped in many ways,
Right.
and couldn't afford to get a lot of people on early.
I think this is important for people to hear.
Yes.
Well, and when you say couldn't afford, I think I see so many companies coming out, I've got this idea, I want to go raise $1 million. And it's like, whoa, time out.
Yeah.
What you're doing is vetting an idea and analyzing, building the product and understanding it. So that first money spent is the money these investors look at as saying, okay, they actually know what they're doing.
Yeah.
They've got a very good chance of success versus, hey, there's a lot of great ideas. It's just, they don't all translate to products that make money. It's not that they're bad, they just don't make money.
Yeah.
So, other questions? Oh, come on.
Curious how you differentiate yourself in the marketplace. I've used Salesforce quite a bit over 20 years in sales. And, just getting curious because there's so many apps and so many add-ons with Salesforce.
That's a great question.
How do you differentiate yourself in the market?
So if I can restate that.
Funnel or tool, which there appears to be a lot of them out there.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not a lot of good ones. How would you differentiate yourself in the market?
Yeah, because the Salesforce App Store, App Exchange, it's a big place. There's a lot of stuff in there. And how do you differentiate?
I would say, for starters, the answer to that question is still a work in progress. As a new product, we'll be on the App Store, or the App Exchange, but I don't expect we're not going to get hundreds of customers that are just going to go type in, I'm looking for something in my funnel and find it. I mean, a lot of our customer base is going to come from outbound traditional sales efforts to find those people and reach them as well. If I'm having a conversation with someone who's a demand generation manager at a tech company, there's probably 5 to 8 pain points that we can get into a detailed discussion about that are going to resonate with them in terms of how they're specifically managing their programs and the analytics and alignment piece. And so I think a lot of our conversations are going to start around that. And that's frankly how we've found a lot of people that are willing to even talk to us this past year, because we've been able to test those points. I'll be honest, my biggest concern this past year in trying to get those 100 people to talk to was that these guys and women are all very, very busy, and no one's going to want to take time to talk to us. And I was very pleasantly surprised that if you talk about the right pain points, they would spend a ton of time with you, because there's so much frustration if you know the right things to talk about, if that makes sense.
Were you literally cold calling them, asking?
We did some of that, but we actually found LinkedIn to be hugely successful.
Really?
We can get if we send the right message to the right people, we can get about a 10% positive response rate.
Really?
Actually about a 20% overall response rate, but we'll get about 10%. If I send 100 invites, we'll get 10 meetings out of that.
We should do a forum on that sometime, because it's something that everybody struggles with. But as a business owner, somebody has something that could potentially solve your problem. You'd love to spend time, but it's not. It's the same thing goes on in general marketing. It's like the flood of information, the flood of knowledge. The flood of people trying to get to you is very high. So, but LinkedIn, interesting. Great. Questions? Yeah.
Well, one other thing that the lean startup is having the MVP, doing a lot of development now. How do you know to some extent that what you're heading on is not going to just be like, oh, sorry, come back to us after you've done X, Y, and Z, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, well, it's a progressive validation process, right? Step by step. We've had a lot of discussions around kind of what our MVP is and what that term actually means and how to get there in producing that type of product. Well, and I probably wasn't detailed enough in kind of describing our process. So we went through and talked to 100 people through February through May of last year. From that, we came up with ultimately a product design, kind of spent the summer designing the product. And then we went back to about 30-ish of those people that were most interested in August and September and showed them the product design, walked them through a set of screens, mocked up in InVision, and here's what the product is actually going to do, look like, feel like, and got a ton of useful feedback from that. And that really helped to validate, okay, this is what we're going to go build. And then we took that and we started cutting it back and saying, okay, what are the most critical components of this to really get to that? What are the nice to haves and what are the must haves to really make this a viable initial product? And that's ultimately what we've built and are launching in the next month or two here. Now, is it the exact right thing or not? Well, we'll find out when some people start using it as well as part of the fun of that, if that makes sense.
Don't you think it never is? I mean, don't you think you have to start with the idea that the product's never perfect?
Yeah,
and it never is what people want? Because I heard you say something so important is, if you're a developer, and I'm a developer by training, the solution to all problems is to write more code. Right? I mean, you solve the problems. It's kind of like they say, don't go to a surgeon unless you expect to have surgery, because that's what they do. And I think it's so refreshing to hear. We went and showed our prototype to a bunch of people and came home and took some more stuff out. Because if you really dig into the marketing, it's usually only a few key things that really matter to the customer, even though they may say, I want to have this, and I want to have this, and I want to have this. If you look at what's the buying decision, it tends to be a lower set of things that really bring them to the table.
Yes.
Is that fair?
Yes, for sure.
Yes, Brian.
What would you say for your prospective customer when they say the biggest benefit you get from your product is this? What do you think they'll fill in the blank there? What's the biggest benefit?
Biggest benefit.
It depends on who you're talking to in our customer organizations. I mean, I think at the very high level, it's better sales and marketing alignment. It's a tool that helps us with that, and it's faster growth and it's better growth. Now, if you're talking to someone who's in more of like a demand generation role, the person's actually managing all those analytics and the numbers, it's going to be better foresight into what we need to do today to get to where we need to be at tomorrow, if that makes sense. And a lot of those companies, they're doing that in Excel, but they're wasting, they're spending a couple days every month or every quarter downloading the data and trying to stitch that together. So it's getting that insight quicker and in more of a real-time view. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And where my head was better decision making.
Yeah.
I think you're keying on better forecasting.
Yeah.
And then some of that has reporting. So a publicly traded company may have a forecast that's attached to something. So you're attacking all three of those problems. Is that fair?
That is fair, yeah. I mean, the interesting thing in the tech space, right, because since we're selling mostly to other tech companies right now, is you have these crazy high growth rates you're trying to achieve, and certainly a lot of pressure for publicly traded. Even if you're not, if you've taken capital of any kind, you probably got some pressure to hit a forecast that you promised your investors as
Just
well.
from a different place.
So there's a lot of challenge there in achieving those, and so giving them that better decision making to make sure they're hitting it, or to know earlier if they're not going to hit it, is hugely valuable.
Well, and I think one of the things investors look for is, show me some evidence that you have a repeatable process in your sales. You know, if you make 10 calls and you get 2 sales, that's great, but when you go to 100 calls, will you get 20? And can you consistently repeat on that? Because you don't know if the first 5 customers were just people that liked you, or you just got lucky. I mean, can it scale? It gets back to, can you scale? So I can understand they're trying to find that scale point.
Yes.
Interesting.
Thank you.
Question. Keep going, Brian.
I'm coming.
We're going to have the Matt and Brian show. You want to come up?
As someone who's worked with Salesforce and companies on their data, we have access to their information. So confidentiality is a big part of my past role with that.
Yeah.
You're going to be in that same situation. Are there any regulatory issues to what you're building? And maybe not regulation is the right word, but is there anything that you need to take into account to say, your data is safe with us? You're a publicly traded company, and your forecast for the next quarter is safe with us.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I don't know, regulatory is not the right word, but sensitivity. There's a ton of sensitivity around those issues. Yes, the short answer is yes, there's issues around that. We're still kind of working through some of those, because part of it starts with just building a trusted relationship, but there certainly is a discussion around, liabilities and risks and all of that. One of the things that we're being very careful in terms of how we're architecting our technology is that, we're not going to mess with your data. Like, we're exporting data and using it to produce the information that you need, but it's not like we're going in and, we're not in the business of editing all your Salesforce data.
You're not modifying the data.
We're not modifying it.
You're leaving
correct.
the source data as is.
That is correct. So.
Interesting. Yeah.
In your customer discovery, your 100 phone calls, you said that you focused on the tech sector because the other companies weren't using Salesforce or weren't as aligned to, what you're trying to achieve. Why weren't they using Salesforce? Why were big companies avoiding the cloud? Is there still some hysteria about that, or is it just that they're not interested because they're rationale?
Well, there's probably a couple different classes of types of companies, right? And so when we did that early discovery, just anybody that had a leadership title in marketing or sales, we tried to talk to. And so it was an interesting spectrum of companies in different industries. There's one set of larger companies that are probably less in tech, but that are very well entrenched in other CRM solutions, just not Salesforce. More legacy systems, Oracle, SAP, other types of systems, or Microsoft Dynamics, things like that are valuable tools that we may someday choose to integrate with as well, but the fit was not quite as clear. And then there's another class of companies that just don't have as much discipline around the earlier stages in their sales process, and so a lot of times they weren't even using tools at all. We went over, Todd will remember this one, we went over and met with a gentleman in Chicago that has selling events related services that had 30-some, 40-some salespeople working for him. Their CRM was a whiteboard in the office. It was also a very short sales cycle, and so there wasn't, like deals were closing within 48 hours of initial contact, and so it was less, their business needs weren't driving, they didn't need something as sophisticated as Salesforce. They probably would have benefited from it still, but that's why they hadn't been forced to kind of implement that. So it was kind of,
It's an interesting place because I see a lot of people that are looking to exit their business. They're in my age, their 50s or older, and saying, I want to sell my business, and they can't sell them because they haven't put the tools in, right? They're older style businesses. I don't mean older people, but older style. They've been run for the benefit of a single owner. And so they're trying to hide the money from a tax perspective, and they're not necessarily into automation. They didn't grow up with computers. You see a lot of that right now. Now, I think 15, 20 years from now, everybody's going to have to be in there, but there's more than you'd imagine that don't use any tools at all.
Yeah.
It's also important to point out that we didn't start off focusing on the tech sector. We were very intentional not to assume who our market segment was. And we started off wanting to talk to anybody that would even take the time to talk to us.
Yeah.
And it just more and more, I can remember when we kind of looked at each other and said, the only people who are really taking the time to talk to us and that this message resonates with are tech companies.
Yeah.
And mostly because they have more sophisticated sales processes, higher volume of leads, and therefore the pain
Right.
point was more significant. But it was interesting how the research drew us to the tech segment. It wasn't our focus.
Interesting. So I can see this I'm thinking about the traditional business-to-business company that has a long sales cycle and complex sales cycle, how valuable this would be. Is it also valuable to the e-commerce company that's using HubSpot as their front end and their sales process is all remote and not always even human-oriented? Is it still relevant to them? I'll give you an example, Men's Style Lab. Online e-reseller of clothing, uses HubSpot, uses a CRM system, but their cycle is completely, it's a hands-off cycle in the sense of the sales call as a phone call. Is it still relevant to them?
I think there is relevance, but I think that's an area we're going to have to explore even more as we start to work with some of those.
So you're focused more on the complex sale, the long-term sale?
I would say the target audience that we have right now is primarily B2B companies.
So it's mostly B2B.
Has been kind of been the sweet spot.
Okay.
And part of that, to kind of build on some of the comments here too, so the companies are investing more in marketing technology, using some of these tools like HubSpot. They're driving inbound leads from that, but that's actually it creates a break point lower down in the funnel because you have marketing pushing in all these leads, but how they're actually getting handed off to sales and getting managed and what the quality of those leads are, that really is a pain point that resonates very strongly with that particular audience.
Sales life cycle. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. But for it to resonate, you first have to have some inbound leads and have that investment, and that investment is more likely in the tech space, if that makes sense.
No, it does. Well, that's what they're comfortable with. Yeah.
How did you, I guess between the two companies, how did you build your early team at Spindle Exchange, and how did you compare that to how you're building your team at FunnelWise? Obviously you have a bit more money now to help support that and kind of traction, but what key things did you look for, and what did you do differently between the two different businesses?
I would say one key difference would be I probably hired more junior level people at Spindle Exchange first, just from an experience standpoint, because that's what worked from a budget standpoint, and kind of built that team out initially, and then started to add in more leadership roles to it as we got bigger and grew. Whereas I'm trying to be much more conscious now to get the leadership in place first and let them build their own teams. I think is a better approach when you can manage it that way. I think looking for the right people is fundamentally important to business success, and the team I'm going to have at FunnelWise is a mix of people that I've worked with before and people that I've never had any experience with, but trying to get that right blend and finding the right folks not only from an execution standpoint but from a cultural standpoint is going to be a huge source of success. So I'm trying to put a lot of thought and care into getting those right folks. Does that make sense?
How do you find that hiring at FunnelWise in Des Moines? We hear constantly there's a challenge for talent in the programming space and the technical side of it, I guess.
Yeah, there certainly is.
Did you leverage your reputation, or could you compete on salaries? Like, not to get too in depth and personal, but how did you approach that situation?
Well, I would say we're still in process building the whole team, right? So there's 11 of us total right now. The goal is to be a 35 to 40 person company 2 years from now. So you've got a quarter of the team in place, the rest yet to come. So to be determined in all that, in the software engineering space, it's a very tough market to find talented folks here. Part of what we're doing is looking for people that are interested in more of the entrepreneurial opportunities. You can get a lot of great jobs at the Wells Fargos and Principals and other big corporations in the area, but it's not quite the same experience as you have actually building something, starting something from kind of a greenfield on up. One of the things that's very important to me is that all our employees have an equity position in the company, and they're going to have some stake in it. Like, that's not just a job, it's something that you really have an ownership stake in, and you're part of building this, and together we're going to make this successful. And I think, for the right person, that can be very attractive. Some people wouldn't really care about that, but frankly, if they don't, they're probably not the right fit for what we're trying to do as well. So,
in the back.
So in sales and marketing, there's the internal and external communications as well. And obviously, from a leadership and from a frontline sales perspective, it's important to have kind of like an all-in-one system so you can manage the data appropriately, and obviously get rid of some of the administrative stuff you're trying to get rid of. I found that to find a good, robust proposal system sometimes it's difficult, and then you find that nice, robust proposal system that's customer-facing. Now you're doing some manual data entry, and on the other side of things for your marketing and sales funnel. Do you have like some sort of proposal system that goes along with that? Are you thinking along those lines and kind of have like an all-in-one type of system?
It's not probably an all-in-one type system. I mean, the reality is a lot of these companies are going to have a dozen different tools that they're going to be using for different parts and pieces of their marketing and sales process. That's just the reality of the landscape right now. You want integration between them, so it's hopefully not much repetitive manual data entry, but they're going to be different solutions. Now, I think if you look at the long-term trends, it would make sense for those things to over time consolidate into more of a platform type approach. It's a great reason for a big company to buy us someday further down the road, along with acquiring some of those other tools as well. But today's landscape, these organizations are using a bunch of different tools together as well. So I actually think we need to be careful about not taking on too much and really just focusing on the sweet spot that we can be better at than anybody else, if that makes sense.
Yes.
You mentioned your first company that you weren't able to figure out what details you wanted to, or you focused on all the details rather than just a few. Can you just give a few examples of the details you're focusing on now that you have found?
Yeah, which details matter?
Which details matter?
Of all those details, which ones matter?
Yes.
The magic question.
And I'm sorry, we could open it up to people that work with me for funny stories about details that they can think of. But I would say from my perspective, the ones that probably matter the most right now, getting the right people on board is the single most important thing, in my opinion, and shaping that right culture from really day one as well. So some of the things I obsess over are related to that. And even though they can be tiny things, that's important. I think, kind of shaping our brand and our messaging and what we're sending out to the market, both in terms of prospective future employees that we might hire, but also kind of our target audience, is another really, really important detail to make sure that we, I was going to say get that right. I don't know that we'll get it right immediately, but we at least understand what we're doing so we're able to test what's working and not and refine that as well. And then I think, in the technology side, some of those types of details to really build an application that is intuitive to use and looks good, and is also powerful at the same time. We're spending a lot of time putting thought into those details. Well, figuring out how to do it in a way that isn't, that it doesn't take us a year to build it necessarily either, if that makes sense.
Makes sense. So I'm really tempted. There's some smiling people in the back. Whenever you say details, I'm almost wanting to bring one of them up to tell a story, but I don't think we will. It is hard because you can go nuts on it. It's like the people that get into their spreadsheets and won't stop. Right?
Yeah.
They've got a sheet of a sheet of a sheet of a sheet of a sheet. And
Yeah.
Great. Question.
Determine your initial pricing.
How do you determine your initial pricing?
That's a really interesting question. We asked people. So when we were going through the second round last year, showing people our prototype and saying, hey, this is how it's going to look. Let's walk through the screens. What would you like different? What are we missing? The last question in most of those conversations was, what's the value of this to your business? And there's different ways to ask that, and you might get different answers. What's the value, or what would you pay for it? Those could be two different things. But that was actually really, really insightful. We got a very broad range of answers. And to be honest, the answers initially range from $5,000 a year to $60,000 a year. And keep in mind, it's for a specific set of functionality that we can then talk about what we could add to that and how we could broaden that to affect the pricing as well. But it was interesting because we got really helpful feedback about what the value was to their business, how it would help them. The more fun feedback was around, well, here's what I'm allowed to buy within our budget, or here's what my authority level is, stuff like that, which is from a selling standpoint is really interesting to hear too, to think about how you structure it in a way that makes it easier for them to buy it as well. So there was kind of a sweet spot in there for what we heard from the most common answers, and that's really what we're pricing it at out of the gate, and then we'll see what people's reactions are to that. I have done enough sales now that I know I'm not going to know for sure until I get people actually signing on the dotted line or sending us their checks. Then we'll know we really got it right, if that makes sense. But we have an idea of where we're starting at.
You brought up a really important point I want to just amplify is if you're selling in B2B, knowing the ability to spend for each level in the company and what the average person's allowed to spend. We did a lot of pricing on our pilot systems so that a director level person and our target customer could buy it on their own. So they could buy a pilot. Even though we knew they were going to need VP or C level to roll the whole thing out, we strategically made sure we knew we could get in under their signature ability, not just $1 under, we'd come in 20% under because the finance guys real quick. If the finance guy tells you you've got a $5,000 signing authority, anything that's $49.90, it's like a red thumb. What are you doing? But that's a very key point to know, is that what's that person can sign off on. So. What didn't we ask you we should have?
Those are good questions.
Yeah?
I don't know.
Okay. Any other before we write? Yeah.
How long do you think, or how's the process work for when you get a sale and a customer starts using it before they kind of feel the benefit of it? Do they get deeper and deeper?
Good question.
They become more dependent on it, or they immediately see the value? Or can you predict that?
Time from purchase to value acquired?
Yeah, sort of.
Do I love it?
To be determined. I mean, I'd like to think really quickly, right? But we're going to find that out as we actually roll the product out. There's probably two major considerations with the space that we're doing. So one of the values of our tool is not, the ability to be forward-looking on where you're headed. Some of that ties into where you've been in the past, and so there's kind of an open question right now about how we pull in all of their historical data and really present those comparisons appropriately. And I said the open question is because if their data is structured right, we know how we're going to do it. But if it's not, then we could run into some interesting challenges with that. And until we get to the point of actually plugging into some organizations, which will happen in the next 2 months here, we'll really know how easier or harder that's going to be, if that makes sense. And then the other thing is, right now our initial beta product is something that's going to be really useful to a marketing or sales leader. It's probably not something that everybody on their team is going to use, but the vision for the product is to build it out over the next year or two to really become a tool that individual sales managers and even individual sales reps can have some value from interacting with it to see their funnel and their plan and how they're performing against it and where they need to make adjustments. And that will significantly increase the value to our customers as well. So it'll be broadening. I think that time frame to get value and the total amount of value will both, the time frame will shorten and the value will grow as the product matures over the next 2 years as well.
Time for one more question if we have one. All right, well, Matt, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike.
Appreciate it.